All right, we'll go ahead and get started tonight. So tonight's speaker is going to be Dr. Jeff Lehmkuhler, and he's an associate extension professor in our group. And he's going to be talking to us tonight about a recipe for profit in the backgrounding and stockering enterprises.
Thank you, Dr. Van Valen, and welcome everybody to this week's program. We're going to go through something a little different this evening, thinking about the price changes that Kevin kind of introduced a couple weeks ago, or actually last week on Tuesday night, looking at some of the market changes and thinking about some of those challenges that most of us are seeing in the industry. So this evening, we'll go through a little bit about this real simple recipe. And there's not a whole lot of things that you need to build a key to success. One, real simple, buy them low and sell them high. That's the easiest way to guarantee yourself a little bit of profit. But unfortunately, if you bought cattle back in February and the markets have turned south, that's going against you. The other thing to kind of keep in the back of our mind as a good ingredient is if you buy 10, sell the same 10. And really what I mean by that is trying to think about minimizing our sickness and our death loss and doing a good job receiving those cattle and getting them off to really a good start to try and increase your odds of getting those cattle to market at the end. A lot of times we think about trying to buy maybe some cheaper calves and adding some value that away, but also realize that they tend to come with a little bit greater risk as well. There's a lot of factors that can impact our profitability in this backgrounding and stocker enterprises. Purchase price, I think Kevin referred to this in his presentation as well. A lot of times our money is made in what we buy those calves for. Oftentimes we can't control the sale price. However, there are some tools out there that we can think about using to maybe try and protect that sale price. Dr. Burdine can give you some input on that as we think about maybe some of the things like livestock risk protection management, insurance. We could think about, if we're large enough, a futures contract or maybe even forward contracting those cattle to sell using something else like a video auction. So try to think about opportunities when we have a lot of market volatility like we're seeing now, to try to protect that sale price the best that you can, at least from any downward risk, and allow yourself that ceiling to move upward as the markets begin to improve. We can't control the global events, but you have all seen the impact that global events can have on our markets. And again, those issues or challenges are something that we may see increasing as we move forward in this industry. So trying to minimize the potential impacts that those may have on our prices that we're going to be receiving when these cattle are ready, whether that be 3 months to 5 months from now or longer, is going to be more important for us as we move into the future with more market volatility. Feed costs are another thing that we perhaps cannot control, but if we have the opportunity to try to protect some of that risk, we should be thinking about doing that. And some of our feed dealers and feed suppliers will allow us to lock in prices maybe for a couple months period of time, or maybe that's even a little bit longer. But we might think about taking that opportunity to look at protecting our feed costs and also not having all of that laying out there with uncontrolled price volatility. The best opportunities on the farm that we have are to do the most that we can to try and reduce the number of calves that get sick. The other thing is that we know from most of the work, the sooner we identify a calf that's sick and get that calf treated, the better success we're going to have at turning that calf around and keeping it alive. So jump on those things quickly and try to work with your veterinarian to make sure that you're seeing a good response rate to whatever protocols that you're using. sit down and calculate your response rates and your second pull rates and even third pull rates, and make sure that those treatments that you're using are effective. And then performance, and we'll spend quite a bit of our time this evening talking about what can we do to try and get the best performance out of these calves that we've purchased in, to try and squeeze a little bit more profit margin out of them as we move forward. This evening, some of the technologies and tools that we have to improve our profit margins that we'll go through are over here on the left. And certainly ionophores are one of those that have been around for quite some time. And that is a technology that we should be thinking about implementing if we're not on a program that does not allow us to use antibiotics. Implants, certainly the growth promotants that we have available to us today have probably been one of the most researched technologies that we have available to us today, and still continue to be very effective at improving our performance of our livestock and improving efficiencies. Our dewormers are something else we want to think about in controlling internal and external parasites. They do rob away some performance that we perhaps aren't able to see because it may be 15, 20, 30 pounds, and it may be difficult to measure that on the farm. But the research is pretty clear on that, and we'll go through that this evening. One technology we won't touch on, but something that we forget about, is our access to vaccines today. And vaccines are certainly one technology that has been proven, and we need to make sure that we're continuing to do the best job that we can to immunize our cattle to the challenges that they may see when they are commingled and coming onto a new site or a new farm and exposed to new pathogens. Probiotics and prebiotics we won't touch on this evening. This will be something that we move forward as we move forward into the future, that will probably garner a little bit more attention, particularly if we begin to see additional restrictions on availability of antibiotics and utilization of antibiotics. There may be opportunities to consider looking at probiotics and prebiotics as more of a routine practice. And some of these products we're going to have to make sure work for us in our feeding programs. The literature would suggest that there can be variability in certain products under different conditions. And so we'll see this continue to play out in some of the research. It's been a little bit of a, or at least it's had a little bit more attention in, say, the last decade or so, as well as other additives such as essential oils to alter a little bit of the rumen fermentation that we may see and try to improve the efficiency. But these are some products that we'll probably begin to see researched a little bit more heavily as we go forward. There's opportunities to tap into technology through service providers, and I put veterinary services up there, particularly today with our advances in diagnostic services, and Dr. Arnold will be on in a few weeks to cover some of those topics. But you know, it's really important for us to identify what it is that the cattle are maybe being challenged with, and identify whether or not a certain antibiotic is not going to be useful or useful for treatment of that ailment. And our diagnostic technology has greatly improved, and so that's something else that you would want to make sure that you're taking advantage of. Nutritional services are continuing to improve. Today, we have the opportunity in some of our larger areas where we have portable NIR systems that can go out and estimate the energy, protein, nutrient values of feedstuffs. And so as that technology continues to be developed and perhaps becomes a little bit more cost effective, we may see in the future a portable NIR system mounted to a hay baler, and it's reading the quality of each bale or giving you an average nutrient quality of each bale that's being produced. And that may be a far stretch at this point, but certainly the way technology advances, it would not be unheard of. And then lastly, perhaps it's not a technology, but it's more of a management. We really, with the volatility that we're dealing with, and we've already talked about this earlier, we need to be thinking a little bit more about protecting our economic risk management. One piece of technology that we have today that we didn't, say, maybe 30 years ago was a device that a lot of us carry in our pocket or on our side, and that's the access to sensitive or time sensitive data with our smartphones. Almost everybody that's in the business now will look at that phone and look at what the markets are doing several times a day to make decisions on risk management. And so even though that perhaps is a little bit different type of technology, the access to information and data like what we're doing this evening has certainly come a long way to help us improve our management and try to look for a little bit greater opportunities to find profitability simply through improving our management skills. I wanted to spend a little bit of time this evening just kind of going through a real simple kind of, I don't know if we would say it's a recipe component, but it's certainly part of our thought process when we think about the value of gain. And as we look at the value of gain, this is basically the equation that we're looking at. And here's the definitions of each of the variables in that equation. And it looks complicated, but really all it is if we look at V for the value per pound of the added weight that we're putting on these feeder calves, we've got our WB, which is our weight at purchase, or the beginning weight when those cattle are bought and coming onto the farm. WF is our final weight, or simply our sell weight that we're going to be marketing these cattle weighing. And then our P's is price at the beginning, or our purchase price, and our final price is basically what we sold them for. And so this is the equation to think about when we're looking at the value of gain opportunities, to try and determine whether or not we're going to be able to make a good amount of money on backgrounding this year, or it's not going to be as profitable. And so I just provided an example here for us to talk about. Let's say that we were looking at buying 450-pound feeder calves, and they were going to run us about a $1.30. Going out to the futures market and getting on the CMEs for feeder cattle. I went on and looked just the other day, and the November futures for an 800-pound feeder calf had that November price at $1.30. Now remember, we've got a little bit of a basis that we need to take off because of the transportation to get these calves from this region to maybe Oklahoma or Nebraska, wherever they might end up to be fed. And so you have to take an adjustment on basis. So I threw a $10 basis in there, and that brings that down to $1.20. And so plug in these values, you've got your weights, you've got your prices into that equation for value of gain. You've got 800 pounds times $1.20 minus 450 pounds times $1.30 divided by the weight that we're putting on that calf, which is basically 350 pounds. So we come up with the value of gain to be about $1.07 a pound. And so this is, thinking about, this is our potential to add value to this calf. And now we have to subtract out our costs. And we're going to think about feed costs, maybe pasture rental rates, health costs, death loss, etc. And so, it's important for us to go through and have a really good idea of what the value of gain opportunity is. Most of the time, you should have a good feeling for what your input costs are going to be. And this allows us to make a really quick assessment on whether or not buying these calves at this price is a good buy, or we should pass and try to find calves that might be a little bit a greater opportunity to see the value of gain to be a little bit larger. Now, the other thing I think you need to keep in the back of our mind is that value of gain is always going to be less than what the actual selling price is going to be. And so you can see here, we were at $1.20 on the selling price, but our value of gain is $1.07. And so that just kind of goes to show also that, remember, as calves typically get heavier, the price value decreases as those calves get heavier. Doesn't always happen that way, but in most market situations, that's what we see. So when we're considering the stocker and backgrounding industries, remember we're dealing with margin enterprise, and a lot of times those margins can be pretty tight like they are now, and there's just not a lot of opportunity for profit to be found. And so that buy sell margin is our opportunity to find profitability. Understand that we're not dealing necessarily with absolute price fixtures. In other words, when cattle are higher, and I gave you an example down here of looking at feeder calves at $2.50 a pound or $2.50 a hundredweight. That's a fantastic price, right? But if we're thinking about this in terms of a backgrounding or stocker enterprise, and then you're turning around and selling that 8-weight steer for 180, even though the absolute prices here are higher than the previous example we went through, the value of gain potential here is less, and it comes down at 90 cents per pound. And so if we look at that 17-cent difference on that 350 pounds of weight that we're putting on that feeder calf, that's a $60 difference. And so in a lot of years, that can be our difference between profitability and loss. And so I just want you to kind of understand that going through this simple calculation to look at value of gain, and you've heard Dr. Burdine probably go through this several times, it is worthwhile in these maybe wild market changes to go through these when you're looking at making purchasing decisions. We don't know what the market's going to do in the next 6 months. But again, you have opportunities to think about risk management protection. And I'd encourage you to either talk with your local broker or get a hold of Dr. Burdine to think about what you might be able to do to try and protect some of that risk if you're getting into the backgrounding and stocker industries, or if you're already in there, maybe get some advice on what to look for as you move forward through the changes in the market situations that we're dealing with right now. So really what we're going to try to do is think about things to widen the margin, to make that profit margin a little bit bigger if we can. And I always tell my family to worry about the things that you can control. The other things you can't control, you can spend a lot of time worrying about those, and it's not going to get you anywhere. We can't control the markets, but what we can do is think about economic risk management. We can't control the weather. We don't know if it's going to turn off dry this summer, but there is opportunities to think about pasture insurance and that we didn't have a few years ago. Perhaps, irrigation is a possibility in some areas, and the other proper stocking rate is one of those things that we can do easily by making sure that we're not loading pastures too heavy right now when the grass is growing really rapidly and we run short of pasture if it would happen to turn hot and dry in early June. We need some additional days maybe on those calves that we bought to recoup some of our expenditures and put some weight on those put some gain on those calves to get them back up into a profitable area. So those are a few things that you can do to try and control a little bit of the uncontrollable weather impacts. And then lastly, manage for money and not emotions. A lot of times, in these troubling times, we can get bent out of shape when markets make drastic changes. But if we do our job and spend some time looking at the markets and doing some risk management, we can manage that a little bit easier, and our emotions won't get to kind of in the way of what we need to do to make important decisions. Let's talk a little bit about technology and implementation. It first of all needs to be easily adoptable. You need to be able to implement the technology. If it's so difficult or takes so much labor, then it's not going to be utilized. It needs to be science-based, and it needs to be proven. It needs to have the research behind it to show that it's efficacious. It needs to be legal. It needs to have clearance, etc. Also, in a lot of situations, it needs to be a low-cost investment. If it's a technology, perhaps it's so high that you can't see an opportunity to build profit from it, then that's going to be a limitation on adaptation or taking that into the operation and implementing it. And the other thing is it needs to have an added benefit that may not be profitability. It may simply be improvement of efficiency. And I think that leads into what Dr. Van Valen will present next week. Sometimes the technology may be costly, but that cost is returned in improving labor efficiency or improving efficiencies elsewhere. And so don't always think about it being maybe more money, but perhaps just an added benefit in some form or fashion of the operation that improves the overall efficiency of the program. And then lastly, I thought it would be worthwhile sharing a quote from Thomas Edison. And just because something doesn't do what you planned it to do doesn't mean it's useless. And the reason we say that, or I thought it would be useful to put that up here, is that you may not always see a positive response every time you use a piece of technology, or the response may not give you 0.2 of a pound a day gain every time you use it. It may give you 1/10 of a pound on this set of calves and 0.3 of a pound on the next set of calves. So understand that in a lot of situations where we're dealing with biological systems with animals, it's very difficult to control everything and the responses that are there. And it's certainly one of those things that doesn't mean that just because it didn't work this time, it's not going to work the next 9 out of 10 times that you try it. Now let's cut to the chase on some of the technology pieces that I wanted to go through this evening. First is the ionophores. They are considered an antibiotic, and they shift the rumen microflora population to result in a decrease in methane production. And methane is, again, going to be a carbon loss if we lose that through eructation. The other thing that it does is it reduces protein degradation in the rumen. So we have a lot of our forages out here right now that are relatively high in protein, that are high in degradable protein. And so feeding ionophore will reduce that rumen degradation and production of ammonia and allow more of that protein to pass intact to the lower GI tract to be absorbed. Even though they are a feed antibiotic, they do not require a veterinary feed directive. So you can still go down and buy a mineral that has Rumensin or Bovatec in it, or a feed that has Rumensin and Bovatec in it without a VFD. Don't have exact cost. I looked up some cost, and it would be somewhere, depending on how you're buying it and the volume that you're buying it in. It would be somewhere about 2 cents a day, currently looking at expenditures. If we go through some of the literature, there was a nice meta-analysis of several studies that looked at monensin, or the active ingredient in Rumensin, published in 2012. And the research showed at that time that feeding an ionophore, and predominantly in growing calves, most of this research reflects feedlot data. But in our backgrounding and stocker enterprises, again, we're dealing with a growing animal, and so the results we would expect similar results, maybe slightly better results on lower quality forages. But you've seen about a 2.5% increase in average daily gain here, which equates to about 0.6 of a pound additional gain a day. And so as you think about multiplying that out over the time that you might own it, 100 days might add an additional 5 to 6 pounds of live weight. This also improves our feed conversions of about 6%. Now, if you look at lacillosida, or the active ingredient in Bovatec, there was a similar meta-analysis done a few years ago and published in 2016. Very similar response in seeing just shy of a 1/10 of a pound a day increase in average daily gain in these finishing cattle trials. And then about a 0.9 pound improvement in feed efficiency. And so when we say this, really what we're looking at here is that we're reducing the amount of feed required to put on a pound of live weight by about 10%. And so, we're looking at an opportunity here to save somewhere between 5 and 10% in feed costs to put on the same amount of weight when we're using an ionophore. In these young lightweight calves, also realize the ionophores help us reduce the risk of coccidiosis or bloody scours. Coccidia are a natural occurring protozoa in the intestinal tract of cattle. Oftentimes when we see an outbreak is when cattle get stressed. So when they're weaned or when they go through perhaps an auction market and are commingled with other calves and then put on a truck and hauled for several hours. If their immune system gets weakened and you change the diet drastically because they were off of feed for a while and then put on different types of feed, coccidia breaks may occur. And so the ionophores have an opportunity to help reduce the incidence of coccidia outbreaks and keep these calves from developing that bloody scours. That's a telltale sign of that. If we were to try to put a little bit of value return on this, what I did was take the 5.6% improvement in feed to gain here with Rumensin, since it was the smaller of the two, and just looked at our feed conversion improvement. And so if we had cattle that were performing at about 7 pounds of dry matter for every pound of gain, this would reduce that to 6.65 to 1. And if we said feed was costing today in a backgrounding enterprise maybe $180 a ton, then our cost savings here would be about 3 cents per pound. And so, if we assume again it was costing us 2 cents to feed it and it returned 3 cents, then that means over a 200-pound gain, it's returning about $2 a head. So, not necessarily huge returns, but realize this also does not include the potential of reducing the incidence of coccidiosis and maybe getting calves that are really going to perform poorly and potentially even in some situations die from the coccidia burden. So it is going to potentially have a return on our money and our investment, even if we don't have coccidia issues to deal with. Let's talk about growth promotants and implants. Again, looking at some of the feedlot data, because this is where most of the work is done, but the research is also very similar if we look at cattle that are back out on stockers, out on grass, or if we look at calves that are backgrounded for 45 days, the responses tend to be very similar. And so this meta-analysis was conducted in 2009, and I just wanted to share with you the data, and we break it out in the heifers and steers as well. There were 9 trials in this meta-analysis that involved heifers, and the average response was 0.2 pounds a day gain. If we look at the steer data from 44 studies that were involved in this meta-analysis, the steers actually had slightly higher improvements in average daily gain of almost 0.6 pounds a day. And if we look at young lightweight calves out on grass, conservatively, we would anticipate 0.2 to 1/4 pound a day additional gain in steers and heifers out on pasture. And even on suckling calves that are still nursing cows, the literature would suggest that we should expect somewhere between 1/10 to 0.2 pound a day additional gain for those calves that are going to be implanted while still on the cow. It's important to understand also that our implant response is going to be slightly larger with a higher plane of nutrition. And so we may not see quite as big a response in a stocker type of situation as what you would see up there in that feedlot steer 0.6. But let's just say that we got a 1/4 pound a day advantage in a 100-day stocker program or backgrounding program. That's 25 additional pounds that we're going to have to sell when it comes market time. And a lot of our implants today, the cost of the actual product, depending on what product you use, could be anywhere from maybe say $1.25 for a row grow up to about $3.50 for something like a Synovex or a Revlor type product. If you look at the longer duration, the 200-day implants and longer, they're going to be certainly more expensive because of the longer payout period and the reduction in labor that is involved in having to get those calves up to reimplant them. But I think it's important that we think about this technology because it's one of the few that you could take to the gambling boat if you're a gambler and bet on pretty well every time and see a positive return. Metaphylaxis treatment. Recall that metaphylaxis is simply providing cattle an antibiotic on arrival. And so if we've got new calves that we've purchased in, as soon as they get off that truck, we would be giving them an antibiotic and trying to keep those calves healthy. There was a meta-analysis performed in this same trial looking at metaphylaxis treatment, and there were 20 studies involved in that. It increased average daily gain about 1/4 pound a day over the feeding period of those trials. And more importantly, there was a 26% reduction in morbidity. Now, that doesn't mean that we're taking and we're going to save 26 out of 100 calves. Whatever the given morbidity rate was, whether that be, say, 20% morbidity, it reduced the morbidity rate down by almost 1/4. And so that's the way you need to look at that value. Remember also, these antibiotics that are given on arrival probably have the greatest potential in high-risk category calves. So extremely lightweight calves, calves that are unweaned, calves that are basically a long haul. So any combination of those factors are going to be probably more advantageous and see a greater potential of keeping those healthy calves healthy. When you think about considering metaphylaxis protocols, be sure to consult with your veterinarian to think about what products to use and then to develop your treatment protocols after that. It's important to understand what kind of disease challenges you may be facing in your operation, and that we're working with our veterinarians to identify products that will be effective in treating the disease challenges that you may be dealing with. Understand as well, and Dr. Arnold does a great job of going through this, that there's different chemistries in our products, in our antibiotic products today, and we need to make sure that second treatment, particularly when we're implementing metaphylaxis, is in a different family. And let me expand on that just a little bit. If we think about antimicrobials, we've got some that basically are targeting the cell wall. We've got some that go in and target at the DNA level, and we've got some that target the ribosomes, or basically the machinery that interprets the DNA and builds the proteins. And so there's these different categories. And as we begin thinking about building these categories, I mentioned at the very last to think about opportunities for second treatments. And so I listed here a couple examples of products that act at a different level. So at the cell wall level, for example, Polyflex or PNG, which are our penicillin type products. Naxel or Nexanel are examples of products that would work at that cell wall level. We think about a different family of drugs, if you will, because they're working on a different level. You've got Baytril, Advicin, Nuflor that are working here at the DNA level to try and control those bacterial infections. And then if you look at the ribosome level, you've got your tetracyclines, LA200, Biomycin, Tetradur, chlortetracycline, or just CTC as an example. And then you've got your more modern products, your macrolides down here, like your Draxin, your Micotil, and Zactran. And so it's important that we don't go in with two products back to back necessarily if you've got a product that's simply not maybe giving you the results that you're seeing. So the veterinarian involvement today is critical because of the ability that we have with our diagnostic tools to find out if there's any potential resistance to any of the products that you might currently be using, and that could help explain why you're not seeing cattle turning around as quickly as what you'd like. Let's talk about our Anthelmintics, or our dewormers, for controlling our internal parasite. The literature is getting pretty clear that we are seeing some resistance. Now, understand that the definition of resistance by the parasitologist is we have to see 90% or greater control. And so the way they look at that is if a product is used and you only get, say, 88% reduction in fecal egg shedding, then that there potentially is resistance buildup. Now, you know, most of us would probably be okay with 88% control yet. So I just want you to understand that you may see in the popular press and that we're seeing some resistance, but it doesn't mean that products aren't working. The products are still out there, are showing that they're being able to reduce our fecal egg shedding and reduce the burden in the cattle. There was a nice review in 2018 published, and it went through 70 articles. And in that review process of going through those 70 papers, the authors concluded that dosing cattle with an oral product like one of our white dewormer products is perhaps giving us better control today because it hadn't been used for so long. Prior to our Ivamex and Eprinexes and Dewormectins and those things, we just had the oral products with the ability to basically control internal parasites with pour-on products, and that we've seen those not being used quite as heavily, and so we're seeing maybe better responses to them right now. The other thing is that the combination of chemistries were shown to be better, and so a combination of you know, a white paste type dewormer and an injectable product like Ivamec, or a pour-on product like Ivamec or Eprinex or any of the other Dewormectins, etc., seem to give us a little bit better control. And then the literature would also suggest that, you know, increasing the dosage slightly will help overcome some of the resistance that may be seen right now. The other component of that is perhaps looking at it more appropriately and ensuring that we know the accurate weights of the cattle and that we're giving the product at the correct doses. And we're not just guessing and saying that I got 1,100 pound cows and they're actually weighing 1,400 pounds. So understand that for these products to work properly, we need to get the dosage correct on them. There are other opportunities to help control or mitigate internal parasites, and that's through rotational grazing to try and ensure that we're going to have forage at a little bit taller entry height. Most of these worms or larvae won't crawl up on the forage much more than 3 or 4 inches, and so if we could try to maintain forage heights in that 5 to 6 inch range when we're turning in and pulling cattle off at about 3 inches, it will potentially reduce infection or reinfection of our cattle. And understand that our young lightweight calves are more susceptible to internal parasites than adult animals are. And so controlling internal parasites on these lightweight stockers is a bigger bang for your buck, if you will, than a mature cow. Not saying that mature cows don't need some control, but over time they will hopefully build some immunization or resistance to internal parasites. Work with your veterinarian to think about fecal egg counts for development of a strategic deworming protocol. You know, we may not be needing to go in there every 21 to 28 days and deworming. Taking some fecal egg count or taking some fecals into the vet and having them do some counts to see what your egg shedding is, and then develop a protocol to determine at what point should we begin treating cattle is going to be something as we move forward, and we don't necessarily see new products in the pipeline in the next few years, that this will help us to try and stretch any potential concerns about resistance over time. If I look back at the literature in the response that we're seeing with deworming, it would suggest that even a single deworming on our stocker calves would provide us about a 30 to 35 pound increase in gain over a 150-day grazing period. And so this is nothing to scoff at. And again, we're thinking about these lightweight calves, putting 4-weight type calves out on pasture. They're going to be our most susceptible groups. And so try to control those the best that we can so that we're not robbing those cattle. We get a lot of questions about the extended release Eprinomectin or long range product. And so I thought I would just go through some of the recent literature. There was some work that was done out of Illinois, published on cows in 2019. And I've got a column here that's your controls. So this group of cattle would not have gotten any treatment. And then you've got 2 different variables or treatments. And as we move down the table, you'll see that it differs. In the cow work, they did a single treatment in May, or they came back and gave a single treatment in August. And this is mainly to think about cleaning these cows up as pastures begin to come back and get that rain that they need in September and October and really begin to flourish. There's also then the increased risk of getting these cattle reinfected in this kind of early fall time frame. If you look at 160-day fecal egg counts, there was a slight reduction, and you look at 0.7 fecal egg counts per gram down to 0.03 and 0.02. And so it did show in both situations to respond kind of similarly. The question with the Asian longhorn tick and whether or not it may help reduce the incidence of ticks, they did not see any differences, but the infestations were relatively low. And so I'm not sure that maybe is necessarily the best test. So there was no difference between controls and those that got it in May or those that got it in August. Cow body weight and body condition scores did not differ between controls and those that got treated in May or August. They also looked at heifers, developing heifers, and this was a longer study that they actually followed through from basically development all the way up through breeding. So it's a 290-day trial. If you look simply at weight gain, the 291-day weight gain advantage was 43 pounds over that period of time. And overall pregnancy rate, which is perhaps the most interesting, was a pretty significant improvement in pregnancy rates, 68% in those that did not get treated with long range versus 84% preg rates. And when you went back and looked at some of the data, it tends to point to the fact that these cattle, for whatever reason, had that higher weight gain advantage and we're in a more positive energy balance. And you've heard us and Dr. Anderson and all of us talk about trying to maintain cattle in a positive energy balance through the breeding season. This is just another potential example that shows that. It's another trial that looked at 76-day average daily gains with products that were either Dewormectin or Eprinomectin. It's about a 23-pound weight advantage here. They did not have controls, so we don't know what untreated cattle would have done. And then in 2013, Kunkel did a summary of 7 different trials at 7 different states looking at weight gains. I showed just the potential variation in weight gains of the controls. There was significant site-to-site variation in performance. But at the end of the day, the data on average was basically identical to the recent work that was done at Illinois on growing heifers with a 43-pound weight advantage when long range was administered. Now, wrapping up, we'll talk a little bit about fly control. They are certainly a nuisance, and perhaps more from the regards of pink eye issues, but horn flies are the ones that we really want to also be thinking about, because there are biting flies and will feed on the blood of the cattle, and so you're taking nutrients away from those cattle, and they've got to divert more nutrients to rebuild red blood cells. And so they also will be trying to do more fly avoidance behaviors and gang up into the groups, and they're all swatting flies off of each other, and so they're not out actively grazing, and so these things cause us to lose gains. Last year, there was a paper published for suckling calves that were on cows, and we forget about this sometimes, I think. But when we controlled horn flies for these young calves on the cow, there's an additional 35 pounds at weaning time. If you look at heifers and thinking about using ear tags, the ear tags provided heifers an additional 14% gain. And they repeated their trial. That 2003 data was a repeat of a trial they had done back in the 90s. And they wanted to see if the ear tags were still efficacious. And in 95, they saw a 17% increase in gains. So the tags are still working for horn fly control. But I would say that based on some of the information, we need to be thinking about trying to alternate chemistry products, just like we would with our dewormers. We need to be thinking about rotating between our organophosphates and our permethrin type products to try and break that cycle of potential resistance in the horn fly populations. If we assume just a 15% increase for an active life of maybe only 12 weeks of an ear tag, and we assume that we've got basically a 1.5 pound a day gain for our controls that didn't get it, we would potentially see almost 20 pounds additional gain simply by controlling those horn flies during that 12-week period. So again, thinking about the cost of what it is to put in a fly tag, it's pretty minimal for the potential economic return that you might see. Now, there's been a lot of interest in some of the newer products out there, the garlic and cinnamon extract type products, and there's not been a whole lot of work, so I thought I'd just share what's out there with you. In 2019, there was some work that looked at garlic powder. This work was conducted up in Canada, I do believe, as I recall. 2 to 5% inclusion rates into the salt mix. And so when they did blend that in with the free choice mineral type mix, it reduced intake by almost 20%, but they did see a pretty significant reduction in fly counts in that trial. If we look at another trial that was done by Dr. Paul Beck, there was no difference in gains with the Next Enhance product, which is a combination of garlic and cinnamon extracts. And they were looking at this in stocker cattle. Philippe Moriel at Florida looked at Cinegar, which again is a combination of cinnamon and garlic extracts. And they also saw no advantage in average daily gains. And they saw mixed differences on their fly counts. In the steers, they didn't see any reductions in fly counts, but they did tend to see reductions in the heifers. And this appears to be related to intake. The heifers tended to have a little higher and more consistent intake, and that led to a little bit better control. So anytime we're dealing with a free choice product like this, if they don't eat it, we're not going to see the potential benefits. Gunter and Combs with the USDA group out of the Southeast looked at this as well, and they saw no difference in stocker gains when Cinegar was used in a free choice mineral type product. So I guess I would just say to think about, use a proven technology. And if you're going to invest money when profit margins are tight, be sure to invest your money wisely and ensure that the investment's going to give you that benefit that you're hoping for. Now, as we think about giving up opportunities, I don't know why this keeps going back, but as we think about giving up opportunities, I wanted to share with you, because if we are thinking about different markets, realize that there may not be as much disposable income as we go forward in the next couple of years. The demand for organic products and natural products had been steadily increasing, but that may change if we have less disposable income. And in 1999, there was some work that looked at the production cost and or selling price needed for organic beef. And basically the summary was that you almost had to have a 40% increase in your selling price to offset the increase in organic beef production. And this is predominantly in a feedlot setting where most of that increased cost is going to be in the purchase of organic grains. Wyoming in 2009 showed that the break-even was increased about $1.36 per pound. And or another way to think about it was that if you looked at foregoing the use of an implant in a finishing program, it was a cost of about $80 a head back at 2009, under the mid-2000 prices. They also suggested that if you were going to go natural and not use the implants, the premium that you would need to get to offset that increased cost of production was about 30 cents a pound on a finished animal that you're going to market. There's some additional work that was put out in 2006. It showed about a 15% increase in price for cattle when we're not using implants and we choose to go natural. And then John Lawrence, and one of his colleagues showed that very similar up here to research that was published a little bit later, that if you forwent the use of an implant in finishing studies and decided not to use that product, it was going to wind up increasing your production costs about $70 a head. So pretty consistent for those. Ultimately, the choice is yours. Just simply know what your premium that you're going to need and understand that your production costs may be higher and that you may own those cattle for a little bit longer. But be certain that you plug in the programs that are going to reward you for that production system and give you the greatest opportunity to see that premium and profit back. You may need to go to GAP certification. GAP certification is required, for example, for Whole Foods, if you're going to try to plug into those market channels. Or if you want to go into the NHTC type programs, there's going to be some additional certification and producer certification that may need to be required. Superior, for example, markets cattle in several different programs like this, and some of them require third-party verification. Some of them simply require producer affidavits. And then lastly, Dr. Van Valen, I wanted to throw this in here for you. I always try to come back and say that we do need something more than white salt out here for our cattle, and this paper was published very recently. If you look at the white salt cattle, they gained just about 1.86, 1.87 pounds a day. If we put an ionophore like Rumensin into the salt, we saw almost 3/10, 2 to 3/10 of a pound a day advantage, which agrees very similarly to the work that we looked at on just the ionophore responses. But I want you to look right here. This column, looking at a good complete mineral, gains for about 2.08 pounds a day versus 1.88. So simply by using a good complete mineral product, we're able to increase our daily gains by about 2/10 of a pound a day. The other thing I just want you to be aware of is, as we look at our intakes and thinking about trace minerals, this is looking at selenium and the blood concentrations of selenium. And so the red is going to be the time when cattle are coming off at market, and the blue line is on at the start of the trial. So think about this as day 0, if you will. If you follow the salt treatments, watch what happens to when these cattle are on salt and we're taking and looking at selenium levels over time. These cattle dramatically are going to wind up dropping. So if you've got this level here at the beginning and we're following down here to the salt, with or without an ionophore, we have a significant decline in our blood selenium levels. In controls, or in comparison, we see an actual increase when we're using good complete mineral products. And so that's important for the next segment of the industry to ensure that these cattle are going to have a good immune system and be able to respond well to the challenges that they may see. So lastly, as we wrap up here this evening, don't think that your feed supplements have to stay the same. There may be opportunities with some of the lower prices in corn and with some of the ethanol plants being shut down, that corn may be a cheaper alternative. We may be able to buy corn out of the field this year to put up as corn silage at a pretty reasonable cost in these backgrounding operations, and even maybe in some of our larger cow-calf operations. Dr. Greg Hallich has an older fact sheet, our Ag Econ publication. I believe the last time it was updated was 2014, but he goes through how to price out corn silage for a cow-calf operation, if that's something that's interest to you. We also don't always have to have dry corn. You know, if we're a fairly large operation, you can think about getting high moisture corn put up and going through a roller mill and putting it in an ag bag. This allows us to get into the fields a little bit earlier, start harvesting some of that corn and getting it harvested in for our livestock feed and spread out that harvest risk. Also, think about alternative protein sources. As we've seen some of the shutdowns in the ethanol plants, we may see some opportunities to work in cottonseed meal or soybean meal or other alternative protein sources if they pencil out and are a little bit more profitable. Don't overlook some of the byproducts that are maybe you're not as familiar with. For instance, hominy feed last year was selling for about $30 to $40 a ton less than corn. The availability is always maybe greater availability in some areas than others, but just be mindful that there are alternatives to maybe what you've used in the past, and be reaching out there and asking more questions about what the cost is, about what the feeding values of those products are, and work with your nutritionist to see if that's going to improve your bottom line. Now, a few other things just to consider. Build your partnerships if you have the opportunity with some feed yards, and think about selling truckload lots. Maybe partner with your neighbors if you can't put together a group. Perhaps you and 2 or 3 of your neighbors can, to try and get that lot size advantage and take advantage of that 50,000 pound potential premium. There may be an opportunity to look at retained ownership programs, and so keeping these cattle through finishing may be something to consider. Kevin went through a little bit of that last week with one of the programs that we currently have. And then embrace technology, particularly when we think about record keeping, ability to evaluate response rates and antibiotics. Think about looking at our closeouts, make sure that every time we're bringing in a group of cattle, we're evaluating them for their potential profit margins at the end of the day. Couple last things before I wrap up. Here is a link for feedback for our surveys this evening. It's also been put in the chat. Last week's seminar with Dr. Anderson is up on the YouTube link here, as well as all the previous presentations. And then next week, Dr. Van Valen will discuss utilizing technology to enhance cattle management practice, and this will truly be more technology and looking at some of the potentials that are out there today for us to implement. And with that, I'd be happy to take a couple questions.
So you can go ahead and type your questions into the chat box. Just a couple housekeeping things while you guys are thinking of your questions for Dr. Lehmkuhler. We have expanded our schedule for this webinar series through the end of May. So if you were on the mailing list, that went out today, and we will also make sure that the links for our previous recordings should be on that new schedule, and they'll also be out on our Kentucky Beef IRM Facebook page as well.
And if you need the CAPE code for this evening's program for your CAPE educational requirements, it's Beef Brew. Be sure to write that down.
And Jeff, that they put that in the place where the speaker signature typically goes.
Any questions for Dr. Lehmkuhler? Okay, we've got one question here. Can you explain some of the differences between a Ralgrow or a Synovex type implant?
So the Ralgrow is basically going to have one of our lower potency implants. It's going to have similar activity as an estrogenic type of a product. Typically, they are about 90 days, 90 to 100-day payouts. Can be shorter than that on a high grain type of situation. When you move into some of your Revlor and Synovex products, depending on the situation we're dealing with, the compounds and or activities are going to differ. You can get combinations in some of your Synovex and Revlor products where you have two different hormone activities. So for example, you may have an estrogenic with a progesterone type product, or you may have a trenbolone acetate, which is going to have a testosterone like a response. So when you look at Synovex products and Revlor products, the S stands for steers, and they should only be used in steers. The H's stand for heifers, and they should only be used in heifers. And then if you're looking at products that, for example, a Revlor G, it does not matter. They are kind of a medium potency implant for grass cattle. And so they can be used in steers or heifers, same way with the C. So it's more important that you use the right potency. So in backgrounding and stocker operations, we want a mild to medium potency implant, and we want to make sure we use products that are intended for the right sex. Good question. And we do have a fact sheet that you can get that has the implant products and what they're basically designed for. I see, Mike, you had a question about one tag versus two tags on fly control. The important thing with regards to that is we want to make sure that we follow whatever the product description states. And so to get the most effectiveness out of a fly tag, be sure to follow the manufacturer's recommendations. And the reason for that is, some of them may actually differ because you've got a different weight class and a different size of animal. So those products are embedded with a compound, and that compound then is basically being released. And so a larger animal is going to take more product to cover it to get better control versus a smaller animal. And that's really the thing to think about. The other thing that the research shows very clearly is that you can have animal-to-animal transfer of that product. And so when you have a calf that has one tag in it and it goes and it begins nursing on the cow, you're actually transmitting some of that compound down in that lower udder area and lower flank to help maybe with some of the fly control down in that area. But it does transfer from animal to animal. Just be sure that you're putting them in early enough. I think that's a common mistake. And so I haven't seen the work, but there was going to be some work looking at putting a tag in early and then removing that tag in, say, July and putting another tag in, compared to putting 2 tags in at once. That may have been done and I just overlooked it, but it's probably more important to understand the duration length and that we get them in at a decent time when the heavy fly burden is going to be there.
All right, we got a couple more questions come in. The first one is, do you recommend minerals with fly controls in the feed?
I think fly control, mineral products in that situation are something that each of you need to consider and in regards to your own operations and how heavy your fly burdens are. If you're dealing with extremely high levels of burden, then they are something to consider. Most of the time, though, we put them out too late. We probably should be thinking about putting out our fly control mineral products late March, 1st of April. If you want to, you're trying to prevent the buildup in adult fly populations. If you wait till mid-May, you may already have established a pretty significant adult fly population, and it's going to be difficult to win that battle from there on. And so there are some recommended timeframes of putting those products out. And generally in our area, it's about the latter part of March, the 1st of April, when the weather starts getting warm enough and we start seeing flies. You want that product in the fecal pats to prevent the development of adult flies. So if you have heavy fly burdens, then yes, I would recommend it. Understand that you've got to make sure that we use it in combination with other things. Fly control is not a single silver bullet. You need to think about making sure that the hay piles that maybe are around your hay ring feeders dry out, and so that they're not a source of places for flies to lay eggs and flies to hatch. You need to think about face flies versus horn flies. You know, for pink eye control, where they're feeding off of the secretions of the eye, you may not get as good a control with using just an ear tag.
Right. What are the disadvantages to implanting heifers with Ralgro if you're planning on keeping them for replacements? Should you not do that?
It's a good question. And Ralgro is labeled for use in replacement heifers, but the timing is critical. And Dr. Anderson may be better suited to answer this question. Dr. Anderson, are you still on?
Yes, but I missed the question.
Thinking about using Ralgro in replacement heifers, generally we say we have to be careful about the time that they begin getting close to puberty, and we can use Ralgro at a young age, if I recall, but what is your general recommendation in use of implants in replacement heifers?
The general recommendation is no implant, but if you have to implant, you can implant one time after 60 days of age and do not re-implant. So you can implant them one time after 60 days of age, and there doesn't seem to be a negative benefit or a negative effect if you just implant one time.
And there are product labels and that will say not to use or can be used for replacement heifers. So be sure to follow those product guidelines. And again, some of that information is in our implant fact sheet.
All right. And we've got another one here. Have you noticed any benefits of fly control as a side effect of using long range?
So I tried to show you that in the data set, and they're anecdotally, it does appear, if you talk to several folks that have used it, there does seem to be some advantages in fly control. And the product is currently not labeled for that, so we can't say that you're going to see benefits at this point until they get the label claim for the fly control. But anecdotally, speaking to some that have used it, they have indicated that they have saw some reductions when they have used the product.
All right. Well, if nobody else has any last minute questions, we thank you all for tuning in this week and joining us. And you can see our schedule there. So we'll see you back next week at the same time.
Thanks, everybody.